Gentlemen, lovely to be with you. Rupert, how are you?
Very, very well, Simon. Lovely to be with you and lovely to see you again, Don, as well.
Donald, how are you?
Great. Good to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Well, and it's a privilege to be here with you both. And I've just been finding out you do know each other to some degree already. You've spent a bit of time together at the SAN conference, for example. So very first question then is, even though we're going to explore this, to what degree do your views of reality converge? Rupert?
From what I know of your work, Don, the talks that I've heard you give at the SAN conference, and more recently some podcast interviews that I've listened to, that they converge very closely. I would be hard pressed to find any differences between us. Of course, there's quite a big difference between the way we formulate our understanding because of our two different pathways through which we both come to our understanding. But I think if you strip away the formulations and you really get down to the content, we'll see in the conversation, but I can't see that there's much difference between us.
Don?
I agree, Rupert. I think that we're substantially in agreement, and I'm frankly just looking forward to filling in some gaps in my understanding from your perspective, and hopefully get some new ideas to push the research forward. So I think that it's wonderful that we're so close that this is almost going to be like a research meeting for me to get some new ideas to push forward on my mathematics.
And that is something particularly exciting, bringing science and mathematics together with the perennial philosophy, the wisdom of the spiritual traditions, which to me feels hugely important. So let's dive in. And I'm going to start with a review of your book, The Case Against Reality, Don. And just to be clear, it was very well received. And this is a 5-star review that I am reading. And it goes as follows. A provocative idea, well reasoned. That said, I cannot see any impact this will have on anyone's life or what difference it could make for the average person to know. And I've got to say, sometimes when I relay some of Rupert's work, I get that same question or retort or answer. And I think the conclusion, the gentleman or the woman who read your book is innocently very wide of the mark. So I think what we want to do today really is explain what your provocative idea is, how it dovetails with Rupert's work and the perennial non-dual philosophy, look at areas it may differ to, and then explain why this can have a profound impact on people's life and how humanity moves forward. So I just wanted to set out the agenda, as it were. Does that sound okay to you both?
Wonderful.
Okay.
Very good.
So let's start then with the hard problem of consciousness. And we're really going to not assume anything. So let's start with what consciousness is, because there are lots of ways of defining it. And most people, the average person in the street might say, well, consciousness refers to whether I'm, for example, awake or asleep. If I lose consciousness, I fall asleep. But that isn't the type of consciousness we are talking about, or the definition, is it? Rupert?
That's very true, Simon. Yes. It's not possible to define consciousness satisfactorily, because being, as I would suggest, and I think Don also, the ultimate reality, it is that in terms of which everything else can be defined, but it cannot be defined in terms of everything else. So I'm not going to try to define consciousness. More important is to try to evoke in our experience what consciousness is. And to that end, I would simply say that consciousness is that with which all experience is known. It is that within which everything arises, and ultimately it is that out of which everything is made.
In other words, it's everything.
If we can see that there are things, then consciousness is everything. Later on, I'm sure in the conversation, I'll suggest that in the ultimate analysis, there aren't even things for consciousness to be the all of. But yes, in as a concession to our belief in the reality of things, then consciousness would be the ultimate reality of those things. Yes.
And Don?
I think very well said. As a scientist, of course, I try to build mathematical models, but I agree right up front with Rupert that ultimately consciousness will transcend any mathematics that we can possibly put to it. But what we do in scientific approaches is to do what mathematics we can. It turns out it's always very valuable to do that. We always get rewarded. I mean, the technology we have right now, we're across the world from each other, and we're having this conversation is due to attempts with mathematics to describe reality as imperfect and as incomplete as they are. And what's interesting is the mathematical model that we're developing of consciousness says that there is one consciousness and that our mathematics can never fully describe it. So, what I love about our mathematics is that it agrees with Rupert. It says that this mathematical theory says that there is one consciousness, that one ultimate consciousness, and that this mathematics will always, in a very precise way, be inadequate to fully describe that, but it can always do something that's interesting, something that may be practical and may be helpful, and so we can go into that. So I agree with Rupert, but as a scientist, I don't want to just say yes. I mean, at first I agree it transcends any mathematical description. That just follows, in fact, from Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So there is no scientific theory of anything, of everything. I'll put it that. There's no scientific theory of everything. On the other hand, what we find is we're rewarded for doing the scientific theories of what we can do. And as long as we're humble and we recognize that this is just the next baby step, it's not the final theory of everything, then we're good. So I'm looking forward to the next baby step, but I absolutely agree with Rupert that the ultimate goal transcends what science can do.
And we're going to talk about your theory and indeed about Gödel's incompleteness theory, which I want you to explain in simple terms. But again, just to bring it back to the hard problem of consciousness, and I've seen your TED talk, Don, where you basically say it's analogous to the genie in the bottle. And in its simplest form, it means how experience rises from matter. But basically, we're no closer or to um, explaining the hard problem of consciousness than we were hundreds of years ago, even. Is that right, Don?
Yes. So most of my colleagues, and these are good friends and brilliant colleagues who are working on the hard problem of consciousness, are physicalists. So they assume that space and time and physical objects are fundamental, and that certain physical objects, for example, brains and neurons, and or complex systems, maybe an artificial intelligence, that have the right kind of complexity, will somehow give rise to conscious experiences. So it's a physicalist framework in which space time is fundamental. It's been around for 13.8 billion years, and early on there was only energy and then matter, and then eventually, after billions of years, maybe life, and then who knows how much longer later, consciousness emerged from those, the more advanced life forms. But so the question is, how, from their point of view, does consciousness emerge from the complex interactions of certain physical systems, like brains? And what's remarkable is that this is called the hard problem. How do you get the taste of chocolate arising from neural activity without a hand wave, right? We really want to know exactly what pattern of neural activity, for example, must be the taste of chocolate and could not be the smell of an orange or something like that. And what's remarkable is again, my colleagues and friends who are doing this are brilliant, but I think that the assumption is false that physical systems even exist when they're not perceived, and that physical systems create conscious experiences. And the result of that is that in this attempt to build a model of consciousness coming out of physical systems and physical dynamics, they have what I call the stipulation problem of consciousness, which is like the hard problem. They have to stipulate space and time being fundamental. They have to stipulate physical systems like brains, and then they have to stipulate particular patterns of activity in those systems, like integrated information or some kind of global workspace or orchestrated collapse of neuronal microtubule quantum systems. And then they have to stipulate the specific conscious experience. So because they can't actually derive any particular conscious experience from their theories. So there's not a single scientific theory today that can say this pattern of, say, of integrated information or orchestrated collapse of quantum states must be the taste of vanilla. It could not be the smell of an orange. There is not one example on the table to date. So they have to stipulate the connection to the conscious experience themselves. So everything is stipulated. You stipulate space-time, you stipulate the patterns of the functional pattern that you're interested in, like integrated information, and then you stipulate the conscious experience. And so my attitude is, why not just stipulate the conscious experience?
Yeah.
Forget all the rest. So just stipulate the conscious experience and use a mathematical model of conscious experience and nothing else to boot up a model of space-time. And that's what I'm up to. So the idea is that this idealist approach that starts only with consciousness can be made mathematically precise, and it will stipulate less than the physicalists because it doesn't stipulate space and time. It will derive space and time as a consequence of the stipulation of conscious experience.
Why do neuroscientists like Anil Seth, for example, say, hey, this isn't such a hard problem. One day materialism will solve this problem. Why are they so adamant about that, in your view, Don?
Well, Anil's a good friend, and he and I have a good time talking with each other about this and disagreeing and exchanging ideas. And so Anil's a brilliant thinker, and I would say that his attitude about it is very similar to many of my good friends and colleagues. For example, even Francis Crick, when he was alive, thought, look, we thought that life was going to be very, very hard and a schmistical kind of thing. There were vitalist notions of life, and Francis and figured out with the structure of DNA. And when they had the structure of DNA, then they all of a sudden certain of the mysteries of life unraveled. And so what Francis Crick thought was that, well, we'll do the same thing for consciousness. Once we really understand the neural circuitry, consciousness will unravel like life unraveled. And so the attitude is that physics and science has had remarkable successes. There have been naysayers all along that said you can't do it, and then science comes along and does it anyway. And so consciousness will be another such thing. And I think that that's their attitude. Um,
So it's an
my
assumption.
attitude is very different. Yeah, it's an assumption. Absolutely, it's an assumption. But they would point to what they would call as a pretty strong track record, right?
Right. But in other areas, but in
In other
completely
areas,
other
absolutely.
areas. That's like me saying, oh, well,
That's right.
I'm good at cooking, therefore I might be good at tennis.
That's right. But I think with this one, we've come up with something where our own best theories in science, for example, quantum field theory with gravity, is telling us that space and time is not fundamental. And also evolution by natural selection tells us that space and time are not fundamental. So that whole framework, which has been a wonderful framework for science for centuries, space and time or space time being the fundamental reality, that has worked spectacularly well. But the Nobel Prize this year that was just given a few days ago, in fact, I think last weekend, um, was to three physicists who have experimental confirmation of the prediction of physics that what's called local realism is false, that physical objects don't have real values of their properties like position, momentum, when they're not observed. And so we can go into that. But when local realism is false and space and time are not fundamental, then the assumption that brains and other physical systems that are quote unquote, local realistic systems would create consciousness, that has to go too. We have to rethink from the ground up. So this is not a small thing. Science needs a new foundation. Space-time can't be it. Space-time is doomed. And so we're going to have a new mathematically precise foundation. And that's why again, these are my friends and brilliant colleagues, but we're doomed to fail at solving the hard problem of consciousness if we assume that space and time are fundamental and objects in space and time like neurons. We cannot solve the problem that way because those assumptions, our best science tells us, are false.
Okay.
And so if we start with assumptions that our science tells us are false, good luck trying to boot up a theory.
Sure. And we'll come back to space time in a second. Rupert, why do you think, or in fact, no, I remember you saying in one interview, what makes you think a scientist is qualified to make observations about the nature of reality, whereas someone interested in the nature of consciousness is not? And I remember the answer to your question was not a particularly satisfactory one. So can we just flip that back round? And what makes someone interested in the nature of reality, like yourself, qualified to make observations about the nature of reality in the same way that scientists with their instruments and technologies, etc., are?
Because all the research that a scientist does, they do with the faculties of their mind, namely the faculties of thought and perception. And reality cannot be known through the mind, through thought and perception. So there's a lot that scientists can and obviously do with their minds. But the one thing that no scientist will ever do, and indeed no person will ever do, is know the nature of reality through the faculties of their mind. Why? Because our minds impose their own limitations on everything that they know or perceive. In other words, the mind looks at reality, but reality appears to that mind in accordance with its own limitations. Just as one who looks at snow through orange-tinted glasses, they are looking at the snow, but the snow will appear orange. Why? Because of the lens through which they perceive it. All science, and this may be true of most scientists, unlike the introspective ones like Don, who also meditate, but the vast majority of scientists investigate reality with their minds. It's the wrong tool. By the mind, I mean our conceiving and perceiving faculties. That's not to say that the work a scientist does with thought and perception is not valid. Of course, it's immensely valid, but it's not the right tool for researching reality. So that is why somebody who's not a scientist or doesn't use their mind in a scientific way, by scientific I mean the conventional definition of the word scientific, is equally qualified to explore the nature of reality as is someone with a scientifically trained mind.
So when people talk about the hard problem of consciousness, as they have done for decades, what's your take?
Yes, I think the days of the debate about the hard problem of consciousness are numbered. There is no hard problem of consciousness. What's really interesting is the hard problem of matter. And that's a really interesting question. The hard problem of consciousness is like the problem of how screens are generated by movies, how the sky is generated by clouds, how the ocean is generated by waves. That's the hard problem of consciousness. The answer is it's not. It's based on a massive assumption, namely that matter is the fundamental reality of the universe, and as Don very well described, the hard problem of consciousness, that matter eventually gives rise to consciousness. It's in time. I think in the not too distant future, we will view this perspective in the same way that we now look back on the flat Earth theory or the geocentric universe theory, the theory that the sun travels around the Earth. The idea that matter is the fundamental reality of the universe and gives rise to consciousness will find its place alongside these kinds of ideas. So, but what's really interesting, if consciousness is the fundamental reality, how then does the apparently physical world contained in time and space, how does that arise from consciousness? That's the hard problem of matter. That's a really interesting question.
Yes, it is. I'm wondering to what degree you share Rupert's optimism, Don, because I've heard you talk about 99% of your colleagues still having a physicalist outlook. I remember speaking to Carlo Rovelli. He said the same thing. And so from those kind of statistics, 99%, that doesn't suggest that sea change is coming in imminently.
I agree. I think it's going to take a while, but I'm pretty confident that that's going to happen because uh, human beings, scientists in particular, are just as dogmatic as anybody else on the planet. But science as a institution, a social institution, is not dogmatic. It may be slow to change its views, but it's not dogmatic because eventually data will overwhelm our biases, and the new theories will overwhelm our biases. So, for example, in 1905, it was over for Newton as being the fundamental theory of physics. It was over. But 17 years later, when Einstein won the Nobel Prize in physics, the Nobel Committee was very, very clear that it was not for his theory of spacetime. It wasn't for his theory that overthrew Newton. It was for something else. It was um, something in quantum theory, the photoelectric effect. So what happened was it took a long time for even the Nobel Prize Committee to respect and believe Einstein's theory, even though it had already predicted, the change of the position of stars in a solar eclipse and so forth. They were not convinced. Well, everybody's convinced now, but you can see that even if it's a genius like Einstein who has made what we now know to be one of the biggest contributions of all time, it takes the science a little while to, a few decades to catch up, but eventually it does. So I'm quite confident that, like this year's Nobel Prize for the experimental verification that local realism is false. That's just another clean nail in the coffin of space-time and physicalism. And so I'm convinced, by the way, that as an idealist framework starts to solve the hard problem of matter that Rupert was just talking about, where we start with a mathematical model, for example, of consciousness, and then show how precisely quantum field theory arises as a projection of the dynamics of consciousness, then I think things will turn around, because when you can start building new technology based on the new science that doesn't assume that space and time and physical objects are fundamental, then all of a sudden you're a Luddite if you still believe in space and time. You've been left behind. And so I think that's what's going to happen, is that there will be a new theory of, and it's already happening. There are physicists, Nima Arkani Hamed and others, who are finding new structures beyond space time. So the race is already on. Space time is not just that we're saying the space time is doomed. There are new structures beyond space-time that are being found, and eventually we're going to get new technology that goes around space-time. And when we have technology that goes around space-time and doesn't require the existence of matter, then all of a sudden you're not going to be the smart one in the room if you think that space-time is fundamental. You'll be the one that was left behind,
the dinosaur. Before we dive into space-time being doomed, one last question, actually, Rupert, for you on this, which is something I hear you say a lot, which is that no one has ever found matter. Now, again, I think to someone who perhaps is not particularly, who is a bit uninitiated, that might sound like an outrageous claim. So can you just clarify what you mean by that?
Well, all we ever find are, or know, are conscious experiences. And we extrapolate that, the existence of a physical stuff called matter, that exists independently of consciousness. But nobody has ever found that stuff, let alone found how consciousness is generated from it. We found what appears as matter. So when we look at reality through our perceiving and conceiving faculties, reality appears to us as matter. And so matter is the name we give to the way reality appears to a finite mind that is constructed in the way a human mind is constructed. And there may be other kinds of minds in reality. That there may be other minds that look at the same reality, because there's only one reality, and it may appear to them in a very different way, not as matter. Why? Because their minds are configured in a different way from a human mind. So matter, the physical universe, is just the way that the one reality, which I would suggest is made of consciousness, appears from the localized, finite perspective of a human mind. So matter is part of the way reality appears. It's not what reality is. And it's fine. I'm not suggesting that we should get rid of, that we should no longer speak in terms of matter or it's fine as long as we know that we're not describing what reality ultimately is. And actually, if we then try to find that stuff that appears to us as matter, if we go deeply into it, we never actually find it. Nobody has ever actually found it. We find appearances in consciousness.
Yes. Okay, so for example, if I hold this pen up, it seems like there's a pen here, but actually you can't separate the pen from the awareness that knows it.
You can't separate the pen from the awareness that knows it, nor can you separate its appearance from the perceiving faculties through which it is known. It's not a coincidence that as human beings, our perceiving faculties consist of seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling. And surprise, surprise, the world appears to us as sights, sounds, tastes, textures, and smells. Do you think that's a coincidence? Of course not. If we had a sixth perceiving sense, let's call it Xing, then we would find X's in the world. If we had a seventh sense called Ying, we would find a corresponding Y's or Z's in the world. In other words, the pen is its reality. I think this is very important, Simon, because someone might think, and this is true of some idealist thinkers, that they conclude that the pen only exists in your mind.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that, and I know Don is not suggesting that at all. The pen borrows its ultimate reality is, I would suggest, the infinite consciousness that lies way beyond each of our finite minds and precedes our finite minds. So the reality of the pen is infinite consciousness, but it borrows its appearance from the finite mind through which it is perceived. So as William Wordsworth said, we half create, half perceive the world. We perceive it in the sense that what we're perceiving is reality, and that reality precedes and is independent of its being perceived. But our perceiving faculties, the faculty of seeing in this case, impose their limitations on reality and create its appearance. So we half perceive and half create the world. So yes, the pen, it owes its reality to infinite consciousness. It borrows its appearance from the finite mind through which it is perceived.
Okay, so something that you think could make important people question their materialistic assumptions is to do with space-time, as you've already said, Don. And you come out with this phrase, space-time is doomed. So can you explain why it's doomed? And just very quickly as well, just in terms of space-time, it's obviously, I'm in a room now. I could throw something to that side of the room. You're obviously in a different part of space. And this interview will take a certain amount of time, which heads in one direction. So that's what space-time is, unless, feel free to correct me. But assuming that's correct, can you explain why it's doomed, Don?
Yes, and I would like to just say that what Rupert was describing in terms of the pen and is beautiful. I agree with him completely on that, and the goal of our work is to take what he's saying there and make it mathematically precise. But what Rupert is saying is precisely the point of view that I'm trying to mathematize.
Right.
So the idea that space-time is doomed, of course, is not my idea. So let me give credit to the physicists who are saying this. One was David Gross in a 2005 paper that was published on the 100th anniversary of Einstein's special theory of relativity. So it came out in 1905, Einstein's theory. And so in 2005, David Gross wrote a paper celebrating Einstein's achievement and then announcing that it's over, that space-time is doomed. And that's the way physics goes. I mean, that's the way good science goes, is we celebrate the wonderful achievements of the past, and then we look forward to the next step. So here's the argument. I'll give you two quick arguments for why space-time is doomed. This is, again, not me, it's from the physicists. So one argument is this. Suppose we're trying to measure something in space, like the position of an electron, at a finer and finer and finer scale. To do that, we need to have some kind of radiation, say light, at a finer and finer wavelength, so smaller and smaller wavelengths of light. Okay, that's fine, because you need the smaller wavelengths to resolve finer features. So quantum theory tells us, as you use wavelengths of light with smaller and smaller wavelengths, then the energy is going up. So you're getting more and more energy into a smaller and smaller region of space. Einstein tells us that mass and energy are the same thing, his famous E equals mc squared equation. So that means that as we're resolving finer and finer details, we're essentially having a higher and higher density of mass that we're using. Well, at a certain point then, gravity spoils the party, because you get so much mass in a small region of space that you create a black hole and you collapse you destroy the very system you're trying to measure. And so that happens at about 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds, the Planck scale. What this means, and this is what David Gross said in his 2005 paper, is that the notion of space and time, or space-time, has no operational meaning below the Planck scale. There's no operational meaning that can be given to it. And so it's doomed. It's not a fundamental. In fact, from my point of view, it's a very shallow structure. Space-time falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. If it was 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters, I might be impressed. But 10 to the minus 33, we got a cheap headset. This is a really cheap data structure that we got. And so it's not the final reality. It's a very, very shallow data structure. I'll give you just one other reason that physicists give for this, and it's a little bit deeper. Quantum theory says that any measuring system is itself a subject to the uncertainty principle. It has degrees of freedom, and if you want more and more accurate measurements, you have to have more and more degrees of freedom in the actual measuring apparatus itself. Okay, so that's fine. So you have your measuring system in your lab, and you want more degrees of freedom to get more measurement accuracy, so you add more degrees of freedom. Well, more degrees of freedom mean more mass. So as you're getting more accuracy, your measuring device is getting more and more massive, and eventually at some point, the mass inside your lab is going to be so great that the whole lab will be collapsed into a black hole, and you'll destroy what you're trying to measure. So that's a different, but thought experiments like this make it very, very clear that space-time has no operational meaning below a very shallow scale, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. And so space-time is doomed. And by the way, it's not just space-time, it's quantum theory. Quantum theory is not fundamental either. So, and this is what physicists like Nima Arkani Hamed and others are saying, is that we need a theory beyond space-time and beyond quantum theory that gives rise to space-time and shows how quantum theory arises with space-time together. And so the deep structures that they're finding don't assume space-time, and they don't have any so-called Hilbert spaces. There's no mathematical structure of quantum theory either. So this is big. This is like space-time and quantum theory, which are beautiful and wonderful tools and have been an incredible gift to humanity. In terms of the technology that we have right now that lets us talk like this is entirely due to the technology we got from assuming that space-time is fundamental and quantum mechanics is telling us how matter. It's been fantastic. So even though it's fundamentally wrong, space and time are not fundamental, nevertheless, there's some nature rewards us. And this is the interesting thing that I'm very interested in about consciousness and appearances, and the thing in itself versus our description of it. We can talk about that later, but somehow we are rewarded when we try to give very, very precise descriptions, albeit fallible, albeit partial. Nevertheless, precise descriptions we're rewarded for doing that. And I'm very interested in understanding why we're rewarded. But the next step beyond space-time is now there are things like the amplitude-hedron we can talk about, where the physicists are not just saying, yeah, there's stuff beyond space-time. They're saying, no, here is a specific structure beyond space-time. Here's how it precisely maps into space-time. And here's how it precisely, for example, predicts scattering amplitudes for experiments at the Large Hadron Collider. So this is not a hand wave. This is getting precise new ways of predicting experimental outcomes at the Large Hadron Collider, new ways that do not require space-time or quantum theory. So that's what's going on right now. And by the way, this is brand new. The paper that announced the amplitude-hedron came out in, I think, 2014. That's 8 years old. So it's no surprise that my colleagues in the hard problem of consciousness don't understand yet that it's over for space-time, and that there's a whole new race for the new structures beyond space-time that's going to completely transform our study of the hard problem of consciousness.
Can I ask you a question there, Don? Sorry to interrupt, Simon. It's just something Don said triggered a memory. You know the children's game where you're searching for a treasure, and the grown-up says you're getting warm or you're getting cold. And the rewards you talk of, this reward you say that you get. Do you think that this is reality's way of sending us the message that we are on the right track, that it's a confirmation in our limited world that we're approaching reality the right way. We're taking steps at least in the right direction. We're getting warm, not cold.
I think that's a very interesting idea, and I can't dismiss it. I think, I don't know, I can't say yes or no, but I think that's a really interesting idea. We do know that, for example, if you get the laws, your laws of physics a little bit wrong, like in Newton, the gravitational force is proportional to the two masses. It's g m1 m2 divided by r squared, the distance squared. Suppose you said, well, I want to make it over r cubed. I don't want to do r squared. I'll do it over r cubed. Well, then everything that you do will fail, and your spacecraft will crash. Nothing will work. So if you even make it like r squared, make it r to the 2.1, you're doomed. So, and the same thing if you pick up a new thing like ice skating. I remember when I first get on ice skates, I tried to do what I normally do. You try to walk the normal way, and when you do that, you fall flat on your face, and you find out that there are new ways that you have to behave on ice, or you will end up on your face all the time, and you get rewarded for doing it right, and you get punished by falling on your face if you get it wrong. And science seems to have, so even though in some sense Newton is not right, he was in the right direction. And when I first got on ice skates, everything I did was wrong, but every once in a while something wasn't as wrong, and I wouldn't fall down quite as fast, right? And so that was my reward. And eventually I learned how to jump and so forth on ice skates. And so I think, I like your idea, Rupert. And the only reason I can't endorse it all the way is because I'm not smart enough yet. I haven't gotten far enough along to really say yes, but I suspect that you're right.
I've got a bit more of a basic question, which is, if space-time is doomed and has been shown to be doomed, why do we not hear more about it on the news, for example? I mean, it's a big deal, as you said.
It is a big deal. And I was at a conference just a few weeks ago on mathematical models of consciousness, where there were many physicists who are experts in quantum theory, and they were using quantum theory for their models of consciousness. And so I made a habit, as often as I could raise my hand and get acknowledged to ask a question, I would ask them, so what do you think about the new research that says that quantum theory is not fundamental because space-time and quantum theory are doomed? And to a person, none of them knew about this. And these are PhDs in physics. And the reason is that this result that space-time is doomed is a particular branch of physics. It's high energy particle physics. So physics is a huge, huge field. There's condensed matter physics, there's quantum theory, there's thermodynamics. There's lots and lots of branches. And you specialize. If you're going to get a PhD, you have to know one area really, really well. So most of them have no idea what are the new state of play in condensed matter physics, or the new state of play in this case, high energy physics. And so it's only 8 years out. So it's no surprise that it's not well known even among physicists, much less among cognitive neuroscientists, and of course the general population probably hasn't even heard about it at all. But again, in 1922, the Nobel Committee itself was not interested yet in Einstein's theory of space-time. So these things take time, but eventually they'll come around, and often it takes the old guard just dying, right? the old scientists just have to die, and it's the new generation that aren't attached to the old ideas. They love the new revolution. They take it and move forward. So that will happen. I just would like to not be one of the old guard that dies before it sees what the fun stuff is ahead. So,
And I've heard you say, Don, that there are young physicists working beyond space-time, and they're having a ball, I think was what you said.
they're having a ball, and I'll tell you some of the successes. If you, for example, try to compute a single interaction event at like the Large Hadron Collider, like two gluons smashing into each other and four gluons go spraying out. And gluons are these fundamental particles that are inside protons, and they bind quarks together. So if you do that using quantum field theory and standard space-time techniques, it turns out it's hundreds of pages of algebra to compute just one interaction. And you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of these per second. So it's supercomputers can't keep up. What they found is if you let go of space-time and you do this computation with this new structure like the amplitude-hedron outside of space-time, hundreds of pages turn into just 2 or 3 terms that you can compute by hand. All of a sudden, the math gets easy. Space-time was making it unnecessarily complicated. It's not that hard. It turns out when you let go of space-time, it's much easier. And second, so the math gets easier. And second, if you do it in space-time, you can't see certain symmetries that are true of the scattering event. But when you let go of space-time, all of a sudden you see these new symmetries. There's something called the infinite Yangian symmetry, which turns out to be true of the scattering events, and you can't see it in space-time. So let go of space-time, the math becomes much simpler, and you see new symmetries that you couldn't see before. Well, goodbye space-time. I mean, it's all over. And it's actually some weird features of space-time that are causing all the problem. In space-time, you're trying to force everything to happen according to Einstein's notion of locality in space-time. You're enforcing locality and unitarity. And so you're forced to make these virtual particles, and every virtual particle adds a new term to your computation. And so you get all these unnecessary terms. When you just let go of space-time, you get rid of the virtual particles. So that's one thing, that no more virtual particles, and then the mathematics becomes simple, or well, simpler. I mean, simpler, much simpler, and you see new symmetries. So they're finding structures called the amplitude-hedron, and behind that, something called decorated permutations, which is like shuffling. If you take a deck of cards and you shuffle them, right, you could have the queen first, or then the king first, and then the queen. You could shuffle the cards in many ways. Those are permutations. Something called decorated permutations, to the surprise of everybody, is the deepest structure they found behind like the amplitude-hedron. So somehow the universe, by the way, the amplitude-hedron is just this big geometric object. It's like this big, it's described as a jewel beyond space-time. It's like this monolith. It could have trillions of dimensions, even more. So it's this, there's no dynamics. It's just this geometric structure sitting outside of space-time. It's just sitting there. And then behind it is this other structure of decorated permutations, and these things are doing magic, right? The structure of the amplitude-hedron actually codes for unitarity and locality. So the edges, the vertices, the edges, the faces, that whole structure of this geometry actually encodes the properties of space-time in the structure abstractly, and the volumes of the structure encode the scattering probabilities. This is what they call the scattering amplitudes. And then behind that is this deeper thing called decorated permutations that captures the essence of this geometric structure. But there's no dynamics, and no one knows who ordered that. So why is it that when we take off our space-time headset and we start looking beyond space-time, right? If you think about it, science has been studying our headset, our space-time headset. That's what science is. So we've sharpened our tools. We really have learned how to study our headset. Now we're taking our first step in the last 10 years. We're taking the headset off and saying, let's use our tools to discover structures beyond space-time. And there we see this monolith, the amplituhedron, and then the decorated permutations. And my feeling is, it's like, you remember the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey? There's a scene in which the monolith appears, and there's all these apes that at first are scared to death and they're staying away from it, and then they start banging on it and hooting and hollering. They know it's like it's pregnant with meaning, but they're clueless as to what it's about. And that's where we are. We found this monolith beyond space-time, and we're beating on it, and we're, what is this? We know it's really important. It's got some deep meaning, but we have no idea what it is and no dynamics yet. So physics has moved beyond space-time. It's found static structures, but it has not yet found a dynamics. So this is a really, really fun time.
Okay. Rupert, I've got a couple of questions for you. And actually, firstly, that, finding slim from pages and pages that are the most powerful computers on Earth couldn't deal with, to something manageable when space-time is dismissed, that seems to fit very well with your children's game of you're getting warmer. That's immediately what leapt out to me. But my question for you, Rupert, is this: is you also assert that space-time is an illusion, but not coming at it from the scientific angle. How do you do that?
Yes, I like Don, think that space-time is an illusion. And just to be clear about this, because this is something that is often misunderstood, by saying that something is an illusion, it doesn't imply that it is not real. An illusion is something that is real, but that is not what it appears to be. So the Caribbean beach that we dream of at night is not a real Caribbean beach made out of sand and sea and air, but it is real as the activity of our own mind. So I agree that space-time is an illusion, which doesn't mean that it's not real. It's an illusory appearance of something that lies behind it that cannot be captured by our perceiving faculties. So in fact, one of my questions that I'd like to come back to in a minute for you, Don, is that this jewel behind space-time, with what region of the mind can we investigate it, given that the normal tools of the mind, thought and perception, impose their own limitations on reality and make it appear as space-time. So I'd like to ask you about that, Dom. Let me just finish by responding to your question, Simon. Yes, I've come at it from a completely different angle from Don, more experiential and introspective. And really, I reasoned, if I were to reason the process, although for me the process came before the reasoning and the explanation. In the waking state, we have thoughts and images and sensations and perceptions. And that constitutes our waking state experience: thoughts and images on the inside, sensations of the body, and perceptions of the world on the outside. Then as we fall asleep, sensations and perceptions leave us. We no longer experience the world or the body. We enter what we consider to be a dream state, just consists of thoughts and images. And then thoughts and images leave us, and all that remains is consciousness. So the consciousness was present in both the two previous states, but it was colored by thoughts, images, sensations, and perceptions in the waking state, and just thoughts and images in the dream state. But as the activity, as thinking and perceiving, thoughts, images, sensations, and perceptions, as they leave, as we fall asleep, in other words, as the activity of the finite mind ceases, the more deeply we fall asleep, and at some point there's no activity of the mind, there's just consciousness. And as the activity of the mind ceases, as thinking and perceiving cease, surprise, surprise, our experience of time and space disappear. Could it be, therefore, that our experience of time and space is profoundly and directly linked to the faculties of thinking and perceiving. Well, yes, of course. Thinking takes place in a single dimension. What do we call that? Time. Perceiving, seeing, hearing, touching, but particularly seeing, takes place in 3 dimensions. What do we call that? Space. Could it be that what we call time and space are how the reality that lies behind the appearance of time and space appear to our thinking and perceiving faculties? In other words, it is thought and perception that project time and space, or render reality as time and space. Time and space is the orange tinted snow. There's something real there. I'm not saying it's non-existent or unreal. It is real, but its reality is nothing like time and space. When you, to use an analogy, when we look at a movie, we see a 3-dimensional landscape. When we go up to it and touch it, we find its reality, relatively speaking, is a 2-dimensional screen. So something that is in reality, relatively speaking, has 2 dimensions, appears as 3 dimensions. Well, time and space appear to us in 4 dimensions, 1 dimension of time, 3 of space. But behind that, could that be a 4-dimensional appearance of something which behind it has less dimensions? And I would say if you go all the way back through the beautiful jewel that Don talked about, through whatever the structure is behind that, I can't remember what you call it. If you go back through all the data structures to the ultimate reality, I would suggest consciousness has no dimensions at all. And we cannot think of that. We cannot even imagine something with no dimensions, because everything we conceive or imagine is limited by the mind through which we do so. So Simon, to come back to your question, it was really through my experience investigating the waking state, the dreaming state, and deep sleep, and then going back in the other direction. In deep sleep, there is just consciousness. There is no experience of time and space. There is just the awareness of being. When dreaming starts again, the awareness of being doesn't disappear. The dimensionless awareness of being, it doesn't disappear. Thinking and imagining are simply added to it. Thinking and imagining are, as it were, a coloring of the dimensionless awareness of being, and then the waking state, sensing and perceiving are added to it, and we have the full 4-dimensional appearance of the world. But it's all made of this dimensionless consciousness, which is the ultimate reality that lies behind and appears as time and space in the waking state.
Rupert, do you want to ask your question to Don about that structure beyond space-time?
Yes, it was. If what I've just said is true, if Don, you feel that what I've just said is true, that our faculties of thinking and perceiving impose or render reality as time and space, then with what faculty are we able to explore this, the dimensions that lie between time and space, and if you go all the way back, dimensionless consciousness? But what you're suggesting is that there are structures in between time and space before you get all the way back to dimensionless consciousness. We have, I would suggest we have access to time and space through our thinking and perceiving faculties, access to the ultimate reality through the pure awareness of being. But with what faculty are we able to access the regions behind time and space and in front of infinite consciousness, so to speak?
Right. I love the description you just gave, by the way. It's beautiful. So I'm on the same page with you about our perceptions of space and time being essentially the result of a filter that's or a projection. Absolutely. And in terms of, and by the way, that's precisely what I'm working on right now in a paper that we just submitted for publication. We have some steps on that where we actually show precisely the kind of filtering that leads to space-time from a model of consciousness. And a paper I'm working on, getting ready to write right now, is going into more detail about exactly how that filter works that will create space and time. And that paper is going to be tapping into the amplitude and the decorated permutations idea. But your question is a very, very good and deep one about what faculty are we using to do this work beyond space-time. So it's a complicated issue, so I'll take little pieces of it first. The first thing is that the physicists who are doing this work beyond space-time always know that whatever structures they propose beyond space-time, they have to show how they project into space-time where we can test them. So you're not free to just postulate anything you want out there and have fun. Have fun, but eventually you have to show exactly how space and time and particles and their dynamics arise from this structure beyond space-time. If you can't do that, you're not doing science. So we absolutely can only test things inside space and time, like at the collider and so forth. And so any theory of what's beyond space-time has to have a precise mathematical projection into space-time, into Einstein's relativistic space-time, for example, quantum field theory, and so forth, and ultimately Einstein's curved space-time, gravity. Now, the structures that what the faculty that the physicists are using right now, the first one I'll talk about is mathematics, right? So what they've done is they say, okay, we have all these hints. What they found were when they did the mathematics in space-time, there were these complicated things, but every once in a while they would find a formula. Someone would just discover a formula. Some mathematician. By the way, you could do it now you can do this real easy. You don't need hundreds of pages. Here's a simple formula. Everybody looking, holy smoke, where did that come from? Right? It was like a hint. It was a mathematical hint that there's some other way of thinking about this whole thing. There's these guys, Park and Taylor. There's a Park-Taylor formula that came out 30, 40 years ago. And everybody goes, whoa, is that a one-off? Or, were they just lucky? And it turned out we got lucky over and over again. And finally, so what the mathematicians and the physicists did was, well, can we posit some structure beyond space-time that would project to space-time and give us these formulas? And so you can see what they're doing. We're getting all these hints. And okay, so now I have to make this creative leap. Okay, there's this structure. I'm letting go of space-time. I'm letting go of quantum theory. I'm doing this geometric object. It's not a polytope, but it's like a polytope. So they postulate it.
And could it ever be more than that, Don? Could it ever be more than a well-informed inference, tested in our interface of time and space, but not actually experienced? Or could it be more than an inference?
I think it eventually will. I think it eventually will be the source of new technology. So for example, right now, if you and I want to go to the Andromeda galaxy, which is the closest galaxy, it's 2.4 million light years away. Well, we're not going to make it in our lifetime, and our great grandkids won't make it either in their lifetime. So we can't even get to the nearest galaxy going through space-time. But what if we realize that space-time is just our headset? It's just a data structure. It's not the reality. And we discover the first layer of quote unquote software outside of that headset, namely the amplitude, for example, and decorated permutations. Why shouldn't we be able to get new technologies where we don't go through space-time, we go around space-time? Then all of a sudden, what's going to happen is, our addiction to space-time, the limits that we have right now in our thinking, most of us, when I say there's something beyond space-time, I've had scientists go, what could you possibly even mean? Well, I think the next generation that is spending all their time in VR and the metaverse and so forth and is taking off a headset all the time, for them it's going to be, oh yeah, space-time is just a headset. Of course there's a reality beyond the headset, and of course we can grok realities beyond space-time in our imagination. We just have to expand our minds. And so we'll be able to do that. We have the tools of mathematics to help us when our current senses sort of falter. But then I think we'll get an expanded sense. And then I think that we will get absolutely new technologies. And I should say that I'm right now working on a mathematical model of a dynamics of consciousness. And by the way, again, I agree with Rupert that ultimately my model is just a model. It's not the final reality, right? It's just the next baby step. Ultimately, the one consciousness cannot be described. And yet we're rewarded for humble baby steps of description where we recognize that our description is not the thing, and yet it's not pointless either. And so that's the interesting thing to say. It's not the final word, and yet it's not pointless, and that's what's really interesting. And but so this next baby step that I'm taking with my team is a Markovian dynamics of conscious agents that turns out it does it. So, and we can talk about, if you're interested, that why Markovian and so forth. But it is a dynamics, and it is true what Rupert was saying with this dynamics, that we can have a dynamics of Markovian dynamics that's timeless in the sense that there's no increasing entropy. There's no entropic arrow of time in this dynamics of consciousness. But it's a theorem that if you take a projection, and that's exactly the word that Rupert used, when you take a mathematical projection of this dynamics that's timeless, you will get, and so you project the dynamics into a new dynamics, which is a projection of the deeper dynamics, then you do get an arrow of time. It's a theorem that you get an arrow of time, not as an insight into the nature of the reality, but merely as an artifact of the very projection process itself. And what I'm working on right now is to show not only that the arrow of time arises as an artifact, precisely and mathematically, but also that space itself. That's my current project, is to show how space itself arises as an artifact. So I couldn't agree with Rupert more, and his term projection is, in fact, the right technical projection, the right technical term to use. I'm looking at mathematical projections and showing how time and hopefully eventually space arise as an artifact, not as an insight. And from my point of view, I mean, I do a lot of work on evolution by natural selection. I've got some work showing that evolution also agrees that space-time is not fundamental. I use evolutionary game theory. But this deeper structure, this deeper dynamics, has no arrow of time. The arrow of time, the time is the fundamental limited resource in evolution, if you think about it. That's the fundamental thing that's the limiting factor. All the other resource limitations are a result of that. So what I'm saying is that even evolution by natural selection, which is I love that theory. It's a beautiful theory. Right now we have no better theory for understanding the human mind. I'll put it that way. Not the ultimate consciousness, but the human mind in its projected form. There's no better, the human ego. If you want to understand the human ego scientifically, evolution by natural selection is the tool to use. It's incredibly powerful. But it's not the final word. It's not the final theory. There's a deeper theory in which there is no limited resource. There is no arrow of time. Perhaps there is no competition, no nature red in tooth and claw. But when you project that down into a space-time interface, then you get the illusion of ego, me versus you, of nature red in tooth and claw, of limited resources and competition. And so it's all an illusion. So what Rupert was saying, from a spiritual insight, is, I think, going to be borne out with mathematical precision in the next baby step. I don't have a theory of everything. We'll never have a theory of everything. And yet we're rewarded for taking the next baby step.
Rupert, I want to ask you a question, but you mentioned, Don, conscious agents. Can you just, in the simplest terms, explain what a conscious agent is?
A conscious agent is trying to be precise about what we mean by consciousness and experiences. So those are words, but to do science, we need to make them mathematical. And so I try to capture in the notion of a conscious agent what it means to have awareness without content, and to have contents arise. So that's what the mathematics does. It gives something called a probability space, which describes awareness without content, and then a Markovian dynamics on that probability space, which describes how specific experiences arise and disappear on the surface of this awareness without content. And so that's the Markovian dynamics. We're doing the simplest, most elementary mathematics possible, namely as Markovian dynamics, which captures the idea that experiences can arise probabilistically and disappear probabilistically. And so that's where that mathematics is coming from. Again, it's absolutely not the final word. It's just a next step. And what we've shown in a paper that we just submitted for publication is that this dynamics of conscious agents has a canonical projection into one of the structures that the physicists have found beyond space-time. So I said, there's space-time, there's the amplitude-hedron, and then behind it are these permutations, these decorated permutations. So a few months ago, I said, well, look, if I want to start with consciousness and go all the way into space-time, the physicists have told me what I need to do. I need to give them decorated permutations. Okay, well, I got a Markovian dynamics. Has anybody shown how to take a Markovian dynamics and give you decorated permutations? And so I did a literature search, and no one had ever done it. And so I got together with my mathematician friend and colleague, Chetan Prakash. We've worked more than 30 years together. And we did it. So we showed a way to take a it's a new contribution to mathematics. Here's a way to take any Markov dynamics and give you its decorated permutation. We also did it for arbitrary graphs. So now we have this dynamics of consciousness beyond space-time. We've shown how it projects, and I'm using project as you're using it, Rupert. It's an information losing map. So it projects down to decorated permutations, which then project through the amplitude-hedron into space-time. So we have for the first time now a theory that starts with consciousness and shows at top level how space-time arises as a projection. So it's exactly what Rupert is saying, but it's just the first baby step of taking what he's saying and making it absolutely mathematically precise.
Now, this might sound like a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because my head was hurting a little bit when you were just talking through that. Am I, are you, and is Rupert a conscious agent?
Oh, so great question. Yes, and you're also a infinite collection of conscious agents. And let me give you a concrete idea just so you get the feel of what I'm talking about here. So a friend of mine who's now dead, a guy named Joe Bogan, was a neurosurgeon who did a surgery where he cut the corpus callosum of people's brains. So your brain has two hemispheres, a right and left hemisphere, and there's a band of fibers called the corpus callosum, which has 220 million axons, neural fibers. And to help people with intractable epilepsy, Joe would, in really bad cases, go in, open the skull, take a scalpel, and cut all or part of the corpus callosum to separate the hemispheres. That way, a seizure that, say, had an origin with a focus in the right hemisphere couldn't get the left hemisphere to go down. You could keep the epileptic seizure only in the right hemisphere. And it was a clinical success. So it really worked. But what some other friends of mine, Ramachandran and others who have studied these patients, Mike Gazzaniga is one of the most famous. What they found is you find that the two hemispheres are loci of two different forms of consciousness and two even different personalities. So Rama, my friend Rama, who's a professor at UC San Diego, one guy had his right hemisphere was an atheist and his left hemisphere believed in God. The right hemisphere wanted to be a race car driver in one person. The left hemisphere wanted to have a desk job. And sometimes it turns out the right hemisphere controls your left hand and your left hemisphere controls your right hand. And sometimes with these split brain patients, they're called split brain patients or common gyrotomy patients, more technically correct, common gyrotomy patients. But the split brain patients would have what's called intermanual conflict, but we call it the alien hand, where the left hand and the right hand fight each other. So in one case, someone was trying to make an omelet with their right hand, and the left hand would then throw a salt shaker into the omelet. Apparently, the right hemisphere did not like eggs, and the left hemisphere wanted eggs, and so they were fighting. So here you have. Oh, and by the way, the two hemispheres can be so isolated from each other in terms of their conscious experiences that they can play 20 questions with each other. So you can give the right hemisphere a word, and the right hemisphere knows what it is, and it can use the left hand to put thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no. And so the left hemisphere, which can talk, can ask questions. Is it an animal? And yes or no, right? And sometimes the left hemisphere loses. It doesn't figure out the word. So here are two separate consciousnesses inside one skull. So yes, you are a conscious agent, but you're not just one conscious agent, you're two. And you're not just two, you're a whole lattice. And this actually comes out of the mathematics that we're working on, of this Markovian dynamics of conscious agents. Conscious agents combine, and so you are this, incredibly huge lattice of conscious agents, and each has its own interface. Each agent has its own projection. So we happen to have a particular space-time projection and so forth, but that's just, I call this a headset. It's one of countless headsets that consciousness uses to parrot itself, because there are countless ways that consciousness can take a projection and look at itself through a projection.
Okay.
And so you are a bunch of agents. Each agent is looking at itself through different projections. They're coming together ultimately to two agents, which are we see as two hemispheres, and then the one agent that is you when your corpus callosum is intact. So that's a long answer to your question, but yes.
Can I follow it up with a question, Don? Would you say that the consciousness with which each conscious agent is aware of its experience is the same consciousness?
Yes. It turns out to be a theorem of our mathematics that's the case, that there is one ultimate conscious agent. But it's also a theorem of our mathematics that our mathematics itself will never be able to describe that ultimate one agent. We can describe these little agents, but we can't describe the one. And we actually know precisely how far we are from describing it. Well, it's always infinitely far, but we're always infinitely far from describing it. There's something called, so it turns out infinity is not one thing. There's different sizes of infinity. There are bigger and bigger infinities. There's an infinite number of infinities. This was discovered by a mathematician named Gregor Cantor in the 19th century. So the counting numbers like 1, 2, 3 up to infinity, that's the smallest infinity. We call it Aleph 0. Any subset, if you look at all the subsets of the integers, like 1 and 2, 1, 2, and 3, 1 and 50,000, look at all the subsets, that's called the power set. It turns out that the power set of a set, like the power set of the integers, is a bigger infinity. So we call it Aleph 1. Now we take the power set of Aleph 1, and that's a bigger infinity, we call it Aleph 2. And so there's an infinite number of infinities. And so the theorem about consciousness from our theory says we can take, whenever we have any collection of conscious agents, they satisfy the definition of a conscious agent. So their combination is a conscious agent. So if I start off with a countable collection of conscious agents, then their power set was a new infinity of conscious agents, Aleph 1. And so, but it's a theorem that they're also one agent. So there's this one super agent that's equivalent to Aleph 1. But now take the power set, now Aleph 2. So we have to go all the way up Cantor's hierarchy, and there is a top agent at Aleph infinity, but we can never describe it because we can never climb up Cantor's hierarchy. So this is where I love the mathematics and the reasoning, because reason properly done gives you precise insights. It's very, very powerful, but it also tells you precisely where it stops, right? Like quantum field theory and Einstein's gravity says how powerful space-time is. It's a wonderful concept, and how precisely where it stops. At 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, this wonderful concept stops. It's the Planck scale, and it's over. And so that's what we get in our scientific investigations. In spiritual traditions, they're very, very careful to say the word is not it. The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon, it's just a finger. Anything that I say about it is not it. In science, we have the same thing. Our theories are not the reality, but what's new is that our theories can tell you precisely their limits. And that is what science brings to the table. The spiritual traditions have told us, yes, anything that we talk about has limits. Science says, yes, and here is the precise limit of this concept. That's what I love about scientific theories, is they tell you precisely when they stop. So I'll stop with that.
Rupert, a question for you. Don said an infinite number of infinities, and as from what I've taken from you, I can't quite compute how that would work. What's your take on that?
That there could be an infinite number. Let's take Don's idea of conscious agents, which I think correlates fairly closely with what I would express as innumerable localized points of view of infinite consciousness within infinite consciousness, from whose perspective, if each of our minds is a temporary and ultimately illusory localization of the one infinite consciousness, from the point of view of that localized consciousness or finite mind, it is an individual separate consciousness. That's the point of view from the inside of that point of view. We think that we are individual separate consciousnesses. So from that point of view, there are innumerable consciousnesses, one for every sentient being. And I think this correlates with your description of conscious agents, Don, although I understand that inside each finite mind, there are, again, numerous conscious agents. But so however many localized points of view there may be in consciousness, and that there's no reason to suspect that that there are anything other than an infinite number of possible localizations of consciousness in consciousness. Nevertheless, the consciousness out of which all those localizations are made, or within which each localization appears, it is all one, not just one, but it's indivisible. It doesn't really localize itself, just as our own limited minds, when we have a dream at night, our own limited mind, if for this analogy we can concede the existence of a limited mind, our limited mind is a single homogeneous field of consciousness, albeit a limited one. But when we dream of numerous people, and each of those people has a separate point of view. But our mind doesn't really divide itself into numerous minds. It doesn't really even localize itself as the apparently separate subject of experience that we, the dreamers, seem to become. It always remains exactly as it is, the dreamer's mind. It never really enters the time and space that seem to be real from the dreamed character's point of view. So the infinite, I would suggest, the infinite consciousness is, as it were, dreaming or imagining, seeming to localize itself as each of our finite minds, but not really doing so, seeming to localize itself as a discrete finite mind, from whose perspective it views its own activity as time and space and the events and objects they contain, but never actually entering time and space, because from its point of view, there is no time and space to enter. From its point of view, there is just itself, like the dream, if I fall asleep in Oxford and dream that I'm walking on the streets of Paris, I never really leave my bed in Oxford and enter the streets of Paris. I seem to localize myself on the streets of Paris in order to perceive the dreamed world, but I never actually do so. So I would suggest it's the same, that there are innumerable localizations of infinite consciousness, finite minds, and there may be, we're just aware of human beings and animals. That's because they're all that show up through our limited perceiving faculties. But outside our limited perceiving faculties, there may be all kinds of other minds that simply our perceiving faculties are too crude to pick up. What did they mean in the early days of Christianity when they spoke of angels? Was this just fanciful, or did they have some deep intuition of localization of infinite consciousness, God's infinite being, to use their language, that was a different kind of mind that didn't fit into the limited field of thinking and perceiving that we're able to be aware of, but we're a different kind of mind. So I'm open to the possibility that there may be all kinds of finite minds, not just human beings and dogs and cats and fishes and so on. But nevertheless, even if there are, they could only ever be apparent localizations of the one infinite consciousness, because that's all there is for them to be a localization of.
I would just say I agree. And if I could just ask Rupert a question, I mean, this is now where this becomes a research meeting for me, because this is a question that I'm thinking about for my own research. And the question is why? Why does the one localize?
Don, I don't think we can answer that question satisfactorily, because I think that the question arises within our data structure of time and space, and it because everything that we experience in time and space, it does have a reason. All our actions, for instance, we have a reason for them. That's how reality appears inside our little bubble, our tiny little bubble of time and space. And we then imagine that the laws that pertain in our little bubble of time and space must pertain to the greater field of infinite consciousness. I think just as time and space that doesn't exist for the one infinite consciousness, I think causation, why, purpose, none of these questions are relevant. That they all presume, for instance, why, purpose, it presumes time. I do A because I hope B will happen. So I don't think the why. I think it's important to ask the why question within our bubble of time and space, but we need to think we need to think in a completely different way. No manner of thinking, however expanded it may be, no manner of thinking could capture infinite consciousness. There is no way, in other words, there is no way that we can think accurately about consciousness. In fact, and this is a very powerful meditation, one who, for a mind that really wants to think about consciousness, in the early days of my spiritual practice, I was always persuaded against thinking, because thinking tends to have a kind of a bad rap in the spiritual traditions. Later on, when I started reading Atmananda Krishna Menon, it was as if he gave me permission to think, and I then started thinking. And I was like a child who'd been let loose in a candy shop. For 20 years, I had suppressed thinking about consciousness, but I really wanted to. Anyway, I then started thinking about consciousness, and very quickly I realized that if we think about consciousness, that attempt brings thinking to an end. But it's not a disciplined end. Thinking brings itself to a natural end, because consciousness simply, no manner of thinking, however refined, could ever encapsulate consciousness. So actually the mind that is left free to think about consciousness comes to a natural, effortless, undisciplined end. So that was a long answer to your question, why, Don? I don't think there is a reason. I think the best we can say is that why does the one localize itself as a finite mind, and as a result appear to itself in form, in time and space, in our case? Simply that it is its nature to do so, not for any reason. It is just its nature to do so.
Rupert, can I just chip in here just a sec? Because I've heard you be asked this question so many times, and I've heard you answer it in a few different ways. So I've heard you say, you can't ask the why question for the reasons you just elaborated. It's its nature. I've heard you say that as well, as you just did. And then as well, you gave another time an example of it's like a bit like our desire to procreate. It's like, why do we do that? Like, children it's hard work, for example. Now, to take that, you can't ask the why question. Could there be an answer to that why question on the relative level? Because you also talk as well about the meaning of life, the meaning of life in terms of waking up to our true nature and then expressing our true nature through the many ways. So on the relative level, in terms of, and Don, this actually leads into something I've heard you say about love, about expressing that here on Earth, as it were, or wherever or the other finite minds happen to be. Could there be a why on the relative level? Rupert?
Let me respond. Yeah, on the relative level, absolutely. That there is a purpose to our lives on the relative level. Talking about waking up to our true nature, recognizing our essential reality, recognizing who we really are, not just a bundle of thoughts and feelings, sensations, and so on, and our purpose in the world to somehow bring that understanding out into the world and share it with humanity. I think it is valid and not just valid, but necessary to speak of a purpose internally and externally from our limited points of view. But I don't think that those purposes pertain to consciousness. It's like I'm sure you're probably familiar with my analogy. The actor John Smith, who plays the part of King Lear. John Smith represents infinite consciousness. King Lear, the temporary localization of John Smith. So from King Lear's point of view, yes, the very best thing he can do, if he wants to get over not only his sorrow on the inside, but his conflict with his daughters and the war with French on the outside, the only way he's ever really going to be able to do that is recognize who he really is, John Smith. So for King Lear's point of view, yes, there is a purpose to his life. Recognize his true nature, John Smith, and express the implications of that understanding in his everyday life. But we cannot say that those purposes are relevant for John Smith. He already knows that he's John Smith. He's already he doesn't exist anywhere in King Lear's world. So the purposes that are valid for King Lear don't pertain to John Smith. So, but yes, absolutely, there are real purposes for us as individuals.
So, Don, what's your take then on Rupert's take on the absolute why and the relative why?
I think that Rupert is right, and that the notion of purpose, as you described it, in some sense involves time, which is an artifact of a particular perspective, a projection. And I still wonder if there's an answer to the question of why that is not purpose-related answer. So is there a way to say, so for example, one thing that we're referring to here is that no particular perspective could ever encompass the whole of the one consciousness. No, that's not an answer in terms of a local purposeful why. That's more a structural kind of answer, right? Yeah. And so I'm thinking about so Gödel's incompleteness theorem basically says if you have any mathematical system that has a certain degree of sophistication that can do arithmetic and more, then there's an infinity of things that it can prove. So it has infinite potential. But there's an even bigger infinity of things it can't do. And there are an infinite set of truths that are true but can't be proven within that system. And Gödel shows if you take one of those truths and add it to your conceptual system, your mathematical system, then of course now you have that truth in your system. But then Gödel will say here's a new truth that's true, but you can't prove it within your augmented system. And so what this means is, in principle, there is no limit to possible mathematical structures. Now, so this is not a purpose fact, or purpose kind of thing. This is a more deep conceptual thing. And so I'm wondering if it's a deep truth about the one. It's sort of a deep truth that spiritual traditions always refer to, that the one could never be encompassed by anything that we say. So see, notice that statement. That's a very interesting statement. It's a conceptual statement that's pointing beyond itself to a non-conceptual realm and saying that non-conceptual realm cannot be captured by any particular conceptual statement. That's a really, if you look at that statement, what's going on, I don't understand it myself, but there's something to wrap our heads around there. And it's that kind of almost paradoxical statement that I think is really, so it goes beyond a local purposeful answer. It goes to this deeper level that many spiritual traditions refer to, that knows, the finger pointing to the moon isn't the moon, right? That kind of thing. That seems to be a kind of statement that, of course, it's a conceptual statement, and yet it seems to somehow point beyond itself. And it's that kind of thing that I'm really after here. If I can wrap my head, to the extent that I can, around that, I might be able to take another baby step, right, in terms of the mathematical understanding. But again, I think it'll only be a baby step, and ultimately, what you're saying is going to be the final truth: is that there is no answer. But there could be baby answers along the way that
Yes.
that could be useful.
Yes, I would agree with that completely, all the way along the way. And there may be purposes that are not encompassed in our little bubble of space-time, that are not yet the ultimate purposeless, but as you say, baby steps along the way that are very valid purposes. And in fact, there's everything suggested that at each stage, these various jewels behind the jewels, at each stage, it would have a purpose associated with its particular data structure. Just as in our world of time and space, there are purposes that pertain to this realm. It makes complete sense that every realm, every baby step you take from one jewel to the next jewel behind it to the next jewel, that there would be corresponding purposes that we can't quite imagine, or perhaps you are imagining them in this realm. Yes, that makes good sense.
I like that idea, because in some sense, every time we take a new baby step, right, it's like discovering a new candy in a candy store. It's like, so it's and so one way to talk about it would be that, what in principle, no particular perspective can capture the one, but every new perspective is fun. It's a new candy. And this is like, you call it Gödel's candy store, right? Don't get stuck on the chocolate, because there's the there's other things beyond. There's the liqueur and so forth beyond. So don't get stuck on the chocolates. And again, that's sort of purposeful, and yet it seems that kind of thing seems to try to escape the local purpose and look at the big picture of that no perspective can capture the whole thing. There's this infinite candy store, and what consciousness is up to is exploring all the candies. But again, that's it has this funny feeling, because again, I know it can't be the whole story, and yet it does seem to escape a little bit just my local perspective.
Yes.
Okay. I'm just going to take a deep breath. Okay. So first of all, we can look at the relative why, which comes back to what I mentioned at the start. We'll do that in a moment, but I realized something actually we haven't touched on, and it feels to me, at least, that it relates a little bit to what you've just said there, in terms of almost, okay, we've got a purpose on this level, but then there's a purpose on another level ad infinitum, right? Which is a bit like a computer game, which leads us rather nicely to your interface theory, Don, because we've spoken about how space-time is an illusion. Can you just run us quickly through your, why we don't see the world as it is, we see the world to be able to survive it, and how you came to that theory? Because I think it was 1986, wasn't it, when you got your initial punch in the guts about this one?
Yes. There I got the punch in the gut from a theory of perception. Absolutely right. So the way to think about this is, I think of it as an implication of the theory of evolution by natural selection. So the way to think about what I'm about to say is, evolution by natural selection is the best theory we have right now about sensory evolution. How do our senses evolve? Okay. And I'm not saying it's the final theory, but it's the best theory that science has right now. So as a scientist, it's my job to look at the implications of that theory. So that theory has, of course, it's Darwin's theory, and it assumes in the language space and time and physical objects with bodies and DNA, the modern synthesis DNA and so forth. But you can ask a technical question in evolution. What is the probability that natural selection would shape any sensory system of any organism to see any truths about an objective reality. Okay? So what is the probability that we've been shaped to see the truth, or at least the truth that we need? No one thinks that we see all of the truth, but many of my colleagues think that we've been shaped to see some truths. Like, I see an apple, that's because there really is an apple, and it really is red, and it really has that shape. And of course, I don't see the atomic structure because I don't need to, but I do see the truths about objective reality that I need. So that's what most of my colleagues who study evolution think, that evolution shaped our senses, of course, to guide adaptive behavior. That is, to keep us alive long enough to reproduce. But the best way to do that, they assume, is to show you the truths that you need in your niche. So all the truths, so there are genuine truths that you're seeing, but there are a limited set of truths that you need to survive in your niche. So I asked the question with my graduate students and colleagues, technical question. Evolution is not a hand wave, it's a mathematical model. There's evolutionary game theory. We don't have to speculate. We can actually prove theorems. And so, but I'm not a mathematician, so I first did simulations to see what would happen. And so my graduate students, Justin Mark and Brian Marion, did some wonderful simulations. And we started to conclude that, organisms that see the truth were going extinct in our simulations when they competed against organisms that were just tuned to the fitness payoffs and didn't see any of the truth. So then I went to the real gun, which is my friend Chetan Prakash, who's a mathematician. I said, look, I've done enough back homework that I think this is worth your time now. I think that there's a theorem here because our simulations are pointing to a theorem. And so Chetan and I worked on this, but of course Chetan's the mathematician, not me. And we've published a couple theorems. Basically, the probability is zero, according to evolution by natural selection. The probability is zero that any sensory system has ever been shaped to see any truth, any structure of objective reality at any time. That's just a theorem of the theory. So now, by the way, I'm not saying that evolution by natural selection is true. It could be false, in which case this theorem is false, and maybe we do see the truth, right? I'm just speaking. But if you buy evolution by natural selection, which all of my scientific colleagues do, then you're forced to conclude that the probability is zero that anything that we see, including space and time and physical objects, is reflection of the truth. It's a adaptive fiction, but it's not the truth. And by adaptive fiction, I mean like the following: if you have a virtual reality headset on and you're playing Grand Theft Auto in VR, right? I see a steering wheel and a dashboard and my gas pedal, and I see a red Ferrari to my right, and a green Lamborghini to my left. Well, so I'm playing the game Grand Theft Auto. What am I really doing in this metaphor? I'm toggling in a precise sequence millions and millions of voltages per second in some supercomputer, and I have to get them the exact sequence exactly right if I'm going to win the race. Well, of course, if you had to get in there and toggle them by hand, good luck. You would win against someone who could just turn the steering wheel, press on the gas, and so forth. So if you want to play Grand Theft Auto and win, you don't want to see the truth. You don't want to see the supercomputer and all the voltages. You want to have a simple, dumbed-down user interface of Lamborghinis and Porsches or whatever, and steering wheels. That lets you play the game successfully. And that's what evolution did. It hid the truth. It gave us a space-time user interface that lets us play the game of life without knowing what it is that we're really doing. And so that's the picture that comes out of evolution by natural selection. And for me, what's striking about it is, evolution by natural selection, I'd say, is one of the two big pillars of modern science, the other being quantum field theory with Einstein's gravity. And both agree. The physicists are telling us that space-time is doomed, and evolution by natural selection tells us that space-time is doomed. It's just a headset. It's just an adaptive fiction that lets you play the game of life, and it's there to hide the truth, not to show you the truth. So that's, but now you mentioned simulation, and so I need to make a real clear difference between what I'm saying and standard simulation theory. Like, for example, Nick Bostrom is very famous for his work on simulation theory. And everybody knows it, but I'll just briefly, the idea is that this isn't the reality. We're just fictional characters. We're avatars in some virtual reality that some programmer, there's a programmer with her laptop somewhere, and she's programmed up this whole thing, and we are just fictions, and our world is just a fiction. But then it turns out that she herself isn't real, because she and her laptop are just someone else's program at a deeper level. And so there's this nested hierarchy that goes all the way down. But at the bottom, it's a space-time physical world. So there's some programmer in a space-time physical world at the bottom of the standard simulation theory, and that programmer, with their computer, is creating the consciousness of all the players at various levels. So they're assuming physicalism, that space and time is fundamental, and they're assuming that somehow the properly programmed computer can create consciousness, and both are false. Space-time is not fundamental. Space-time is doomed. And there's no way that you can start with silicon and circuits and boot up consciousness. So I disagree with that version of simulation theory. That's just false. It's physicalist, and it has the hard problem of consciousness, and it's just not going to work. But there's another sense in which this is a simulation. This is just consciousness, as Rupert was saying, it's consciousness taking a perspective, or consciousness putting on a headset and looking at itself through a particular headset. And so in that sense, yes, it's a simulation, but very, very different from standard simulation theory, which is physicalist and has a hard problem of consciousness.
So the programmer is consciousness. That's basically it.
Yes. It's the one deep consciousness, which gets back to the deep question of why that we were talking about before. Why does it don all these headsets?
And then just in terms of your desktop interface analogy, Don, you talk about taking it seriously but not literally. So if I have a Word document within a folder on my computer with a book manuscript, I don't want to drag that into the dustbin because that will have consequences. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that I have got a book actually on my desktop, as it were.
Absolutely. The picture that I've just given of evolution giving us a headset, not showing us the truth, for most people, they think that it's just obviously false and that they can dismiss it. There's a bunch of gotchas. So, Don, if you think that train coming down the tracks at 200 miles an hour is just some little symbol in your interface, why don't you just step in front of it? And after you're gone and your silly theory with you, we'll know that the train was real and it really can kill, right? So people think that this idea can be just dismissed really, really quickly. But the idea is that the interface, from an evolutionary point of view, was there to keep you alive long enough to reproduce. So you have to take it seriously. If you as you said, like, for example, if you have an icon on your desktop for you've been writing a book for 3 years, and so your work is there on that book, and the icon is blue and rectangular in the middle of your screen. Does that mean that the book is blue and rectangular in the middle of your computer? No, of course not. Anybody who thought that misses the whole point. The point of the desktop is not to show you the truth, it's to hide the truth. You don't want to see all the voltages and magnetic fields that you're really toggling when you write your book.
Book could take ages to write. But yeah, absolutely.
It would take if you had to toggle, you couldn't do it. But if you take that icon and you drag it to the trash can icon, you go, well, this is just an icon. It's just an icon. It doesn't matter. If you drag it to the trash can, you'll lose your work. So the icon has to be taken seriously, but not literally. That your book is not literally blue and rectangular. It's not literally in the middle of your screen. But you better take that icon seriously because it's a pointer to something beyond. And so that's what evolution does for us. It gives us these icons that you better take seriously if you want to stay in the game. I mean, if you don't care about staying in the game of life, that's fine. Then grab that snake, jump off that cliff, whatever you want to do. Then you're out of the game. But as long as you want to stay in the game, you have to take the icons seriously. And I'll just say one other. So there are more serious objections where philosophers, for example, say you can't use evolution to show that space and time are not fundamental, because evolution assumes that physical objects like organisms and DNA are fundamental. Those are the predicates that the theory is built on. So you can't do this, Don, because you're going to be refuting yourself by self-contradiction. You're using the theory to refute the theory, and so the whole thing is nonsense. And what they're missing is this, that scientific theories always make certain assumptions. Absolutely, those are the assumptions. But there is no theory of everything. Every theory has limits. There can be no scientific theory of everything. That means that whatever concepts a theory starts with, those concepts have limited application. They will at some point stop. A good scientific theory is one that tells you precisely where those concepts stop. So in physics, Einstein's theory of gravity together with quantum field theory, which is based on space-time, tells you it starts with space-time. Quantum fields are defined over space-time. Gravity is curvatures of space-time. But when you take those theories which start with space-time and you look at the mathematics says, oh, space-time is not fundamental. In fact, it ceases to have any operational meaning at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. That's not self-contradiction. That's not shooting yourself in the foot. That's science doing what it's supposed to do, taking concepts, making them so precise that you know the limits of those concepts. So that's all I'm doing with evolutionary theory. I'm saying we take evolution, which of course Darwin was thinking about physical objects fighting over physical resources, and in the modern synthesis we have DNA and so forth. So we're thinking about, but the whole point of a scientific theory is to take that, make it precise, and find the limits. Well, the limits are pretty stunning. Space and time themselves are not fundamental, and DNA does not exist unless it's perceived. So you get, but that's what we do science for, because it's so precise that it tells you the limits without contradicting itself.
Okay, Rupert, I've got two questions for you that I'll ask back to back, but not at the same time. The first is, so as Don said, there can be no final theory of everything. And I've heard also, Don, you talk about, the theories that we have now will be scoffed at in 100 years, and this will just continue ad infinitum. Why is it then, Rupert, that the perennial philosophy doesn't need upgrading?
Because the perennial philosophy is about the one eternal truth, the one thing that always remains the same. And the perennial philosophy is really just about that. It's not about any of its permutations or appearances. So, in other words, the consciousness with which, let's say somebody born in 100 BC, the consciousness with which they knew their experience is exactly the same consciousness and in the same condition as the consciousness with which each of us are currently knowing our experience. And therefore, a theory of that consciousness will never change. Someone who studied that consciousness introspectively 2,500 years ago, and somebody who studies that consciousness now, will come up with the identical answer. Whereas if you were to study the contents of their mind 2,500 years ago, and you were to compare that with a study of the contents of each of our minds, there would be differences between them. Our minds would have evolved. And if we were to fast forward 2,000 years, again, the ideas that we have now will be vastly different from the ideas of those in 2,500 years. So there can be no certainty when we are dealing with the content of the finite mind, the knowledge of the finite mind. But there's one aspect of each of our minds that doesn't change across time, across space, and that's consciousness. That's why the perennial philosophy never changes.
Okay.
And why science always changes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Part B of that same question then would be the perennial philosophy. Would that apply? That applies then to not just a human finite mind, 2000 BC, but to any conscious agents anywhere in any realm.
Yes. If you were able to have a conversation with your dog, I'm presuming you have a dog, Simon. Let's just say you do. But if you were able to,
anyway, a cat actually called Roger. Right. You won't be surprised.
Okay, if you were able to have a conversation this evening with your cat called Roger, and you were to ask him to describe the content of his experience, he would tell you, I can smell a mouse. There's a mouse not far from here, and I experience this feeling of hunger. And he would describe the world, but he'd be describing the same reality that you perceive, but he would surely see it in a very different way from you. In other words, the content of his experience would differ considerably from yours, although there'd be some overlap because you're perceiving the same reality. However, if you were to ask him to turn his attention away from the content of its experience, if you were asked him to turn your attention round and look at where your attention is coming from, what it is that is seeing rather than what it is that is seen, and you were asking him to do his best in human language to describe that, to begin with, he would fall silent, just as we do, because our words have evolved to describe the content of experience. So there are no adequate words to describe that which knows. But if you were then to press him and say, well, come on, Roger, do your best, he would then start describing the source of attention, consciousness, in almost identical words to you and I. Why? Because he'd be having the same experience. Now, when I say he would be having the same experience, and it will be the same experience as you and I are having, I don't mean to imply that Roger experiences consciousness, Don has his own experience of consciousness, Simon, Rupert, we all have our own experience of consciousness. What is it that is experiencing consciousness in each of us? It is consciousness. Only conscious is consciousness. Only awareness is aware. And therefore only awareness can have any knowledge of itself, let alone anything else. So in fact, it's not we as a person who have the experience of consciousness. It's not your Roger the cat who has the experience of being consciousness. It's consciousness alone that has the experience of itself. And that experience is always the same.
Yeah.
In whatever mind the formulation of it may appear.
Okay. Very quickly, Don, just very quickly, before I come back with that second question for you, Rupert, just quickly, Don. So scientific theories are always being upgraded and we scoff at 100 years ago, etc. But I'm assuming that the 99% of your colleagues who still rely on spacetime, if you said you should pay attention to the perennial philosophy, they would scoff and look down their noses at it without being mean. But is that fair?
Well, yeah, I think that might not be fair because I think that they might say, look, the perennial philosophy is interesting. It's fine, and that's another part of human endeavor. And but I'm doing some hard nosed physicalist research, and that's that's far more substantial, perhaps. But on a personal level, maybe you should do that as well. So I think a lot of them would be open to that kind of thing. They'll be hard nosed about it, like they'd be hard nosed about anything scientific. But I many of them are not Philistines who just will say there's nothing here, but they might say it's maybe not worth my time,
right?
To spend too much time on it. But I would just ask though, the perennial philosophy maybe doesn't change, but our statements of it are just statements. So any words that we say are the finger pointing to the moon. So we could imagine trying that we would like future generations to have better statements of the perennial philosophy than we have today. Or would you agree?
Absolutely. As hopefully we have clearer statements now than people that made statements about it 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'm just going to...
Simon, I just wanted to say one thing in defense of the scientists who you thought might scoff at the idea of the perennial philosophy. And you're right, some of them may do. And I sympathize with them because the perennial understanding is always expressed, as Don just said, it's always expressed in the contemporary language of the time and place at which it was spoken, and it's spoken in the context of that culture, and that culture flavors the expression of the perennial understanding with its own particular qualities. And so we have Tibetan Buddhism and Vedanta and Sufism and mystical Christianity. All of these are expressions of the perennial philosophy, but packaged in the language of the day. And a lot of people, and I, in the early days, I include myself as one of these people. A lot of people mistake the packaging for that towards which it was pointing. And because the cultures, certainly the cultures that I went to, this I think is not the case obviously not the case for Don, but because I went to the East, not physically, but intellectually, to find out about the perennial philosophy, and particularly to find pathways whereby I might explore it for myself. I mistook the colourful and exotic nature of these cultures for the perennial philosophy itself. And I think if a lot of these, and that's often what happens, a lot of people don't discriminate between what is the core understanding and what is the local temporal packaging in which it is being expressed. And of course, the local temporal packaging of Tibet 2,500 years ago, it's pretty wacky. It's pretty exotic compared to what we're used to. There's nothing wacky or exotic about the perennial philosophy. It's just an attempt to describe the nature of our essential being. But if it gets mixed up with the exotic natures of these cultures, and limited to those cultures, there's a lot that is worthy of being rejected in those statements, not because they weren't relevant at the time in which they were spoken, but because they're not relevant in our day and age. So I understand people's skepticism when they are faced with the perennial philosophy, when it is considered to be synonymous with the temporal packaging in which it is expressed.
Okay.
Can I jump in just
sure, yeah, go for it,
one
Don.
thing on that? Yeah, what I'm hoping is that there'll be a convergence of science and spirituality here, where, for example, the kinds of ideas that I'm developing with this theory of conscious agents will eventually be a new language for talking about the perennial philosophy, but with more precision. And these kinds of dialogues would then be what allows the people who are really the experts in the standard perennial philosophy to inform a new language of science that eventually would be so precise that then scientists would no longer have any reason to dismiss out of hand the ideas of the perennial philosophy. They would be forced to take the current baby step formulation of the perennial philosophy seriously as a scientific statement that they can then contend with on its own ground. So that's what I'm hoping, is to see this kind of back and forth lead to a literal like a quantum step in the precision of the language that we use for the perennial philosophy. Even though I agree that the perennial philosophy itself doesn't change, its statement, I think, needs an upgrade.
And just quickly, you talk about an upgrade of the language. I mean, I would say, isn't that what the direct path is doing, Rupert? Instead of going through various things you have to do in meditations, whatever you're talking about, go direct there. That is an upgrade in itself, no?
Yes, but that's not just an upgrade of language, it's an upgrade of methodology. In the traditional progressive paths, in the spiritual tradition, you would first of all give your attention to something objective. Normally one's attention is dispersed amongst the 10,000 things. And because for most people, it's too big a step to go from the 10,000 things all the way back to the source of attention. As a concession to such a mind, that the spiritual traditions, okay, I'm going to give you one object, a mantra, the breath, the pause between breaths, a blue light, whatever. And this was just to gather the disparate energies of the mind on a single object by way of preparation before that mind sinks all the way back into the source of awareness. And in the traditions, this preparation sometimes went on for 20 or 30 years before a mind was considered sufficiently mature to take this direct step back to its source. That the direct path that I speak about dispenses with that preliminary step and argues that everybody, at least in theory, is capable of going directly to their essential nature of pure awareness just simply by virtue of the fact that they are aware.
Yeah.
And anyone could ask themselves the question, what is it that is aware of my experience? And that, at least in theory, should be sufficient to take their attention away from its content back to its source. In practice, of course, for some people, that is still too much of a step, and so there are more intermediary means. But it's true that what I speak about is I try and go all the way back directly. And I think also, as you, certainly, Simon, you've heard me say, I feel that this is the age for the direct path. I think as a culture, we are now sufficiently mature and advanced to be able to go straight back. So it's an update of the methodology, not just the language. It's true that I also, I hope, have contributed something to the languaging this direct path in a clear, clean, simple, efficient way, divested of all its religious and spiritual trappings. So yes, it's true. My language has. I think I've made some contribution to the upgrading of the language, but it's not just an upgrade of language; it's an upgrade of methodology as well. Just one more thing to say: I don't mean to imply by that the direct path is a new path. It's been around forever.
It's still the perennial philosophy, yeah.
But it was always the hidden esoteric core of the traditions, considered only suitable for the initiates. Now, since the middle of the last century, it's been made much more available.
And I want to talk about methodology and stabilizing in one's being in a second in terms of personal experience. But the question that I mentioned, the second question I mentioned ages ago, Rupert, was this. And it goes back actually to the idea of consciousness as the programmer. And the implication of that, if consciousness is the programmer of the game that we're playing, that means it's also all the players, which means that I'm you and you're Don, and round we go, which leads then into that quote that I said right at the start of that chap who said, great, love your ideas, Don, but why does this matter to me, right? So this points to that, because, if I am you and you are me, and et cetera, and we are animals, and the way we live our lives would be upgraded exponentially, wouldn't it, Rupert?
Oh, yes, exponentially. It's the implications of the fact that at the deepest level, we are all, everyone and everything derives its apparently independent existence from the one reality whose nature is consciousness. The implication of that is twofold. One, that at the deepest level, we are not fragments and therefore not incomplete. We are whole, needing nothing. Well, what's the common name for needing nothing, wanting nothing?
Peace.
It's called peace. It's called happiness. That's every time we experience happiness, we are, without realizing it, tasting our essential nature. So the implications, and on the inside, in terms of our interior experience, is there anything that somebody wants more than peace and happiness? I think so. So it has profound implications for the one thing we all want above all else on the inside, which is peace, fulfillment, happiness. And then in terms of the outside, if it's true that our at the deepest level, we share our being, we are one reality behind the multiplicity and diversity of people and objects. Again, that's the experience that I would suggest is we refer to as love or beauty, love in relation to people, beauty in relation to objects. What are the implications of that? Well, nobody yet does anything willingly to harm or hurt someone they love. To take, this is true individually, conflicts between individuals, but think of it on a large scale. Think of what's happening in Ukraine now. Would that be possible if the both parties felt that they loved each other. In other words, more technically, felt that they shared their being with each other. These kind of scenarios would be impossible. It's not that we wouldn't. I don't mean by that we'd agree about everything. We wouldn't necessarily smile sweetly at each other all the time. There would still be disagreements because we're finite minds, and finite minds, of course, there are different points of view. So there would still be disagreements, but underlying those disagreements would be the felt understanding that we are the same being, the same self, the same reality, and therefore this understanding would always work to resolve these conflicts harmoniously. Unkindness, cruelty, injustice, these would be almost impossible.
Yeah, inequality, etc., etc. And
Yes,
the understanding itself, Rupert, would that not do the heavy lifting? Because obviously, and what I mean by that is, politically, we have people like, okay, we need to do it this way, we need to do it that way, and obviously they come into collision. But this understanding, if understood and taken in by a significant enough proportion of people, this would it not, or am I being a bit idealistic, this would sort everything out to some degree on its own?
Well, the understanding, yes, as long as the understanding is as long as its implications are lived. So yes, for instance, imagine if a significant number of politicians were to understand that they share their being, that they're what they essentially are is the same as everyone and everything else. Imagine if that single understanding was to inform that not only their policies, but the way they interact with one another and in society. We would still have political parties that disagreed about how to implement this understanding, but it would be a cooperative conversation, not one that would end in hostility or war. So it would have a profound effect on our culture, on our society.
And you often use the saying, Rupert, don't you? Love and do as you will, and love being a recognition.
Well, I'm quoting Saint Augustine, who was asked about the moral implications of this understanding, and he just replied, "Love and do whatever you want." But by which he meant, of course, understand and feel that at the deepest level, everything and everyone are one single indivisible reality. And as long as that's your bottom line, and that everything you do is consistent with and an expression of that understanding, that's the only moral code you need.
Yeah.
In fact, the only reason we need a moral code is for those of us that don't understand that. And so we need to be kept on the straight and narrow until we do understand it.
Yes, and that's what I meant by the understanding does the heavy lifting all on its own. Don, how has then this understanding that, we are not in the game, we are the consciousness that programs it, and like you're Rupert, etc. How's that affected your approach to life?
First, I'll say what Rupert just said. I agree completely, and well said. Absolutely. So I've come at this from a scientific point of view, partly from a spiritual point of view. My dad was a minister at a fundamentalist Christian church, and so I got that point of view as well, and had to learn to deal with it and so forth, and take the good and figure out what I didn't want to take from it. For me, I've been meditating now for a little over 20 years. I started meditating, even though I was raised, the church I was raised in said that actually was a bad thing to do. They warned us against meditation. You're opening yourself up to the devil.
Can I just ask which type of meditation, Don? Sorry.
So I sit in silence, and so it's not any particular. I have no particular tradition. I literally just sit in silence, and as Rupert was, now I just go directly there. I just, okay, time to let go of thoughts, and you just let go of thoughts, and you just sit there, and it's utter silence, and there's almost like a hyper alertness. I mean, you're just aware, and but there's no contents going through your head. You're aware of all. You can be aware of the sensory experiences, but you're not thinking about them, and you get the sense like, wow, this is really being alive. Getting lost in self-serving thoughts, worrying about this, how do I look to that person, that's all a dream. That's when I'm in that state of mind, I'm asleep. But when you let go of thoughts completely and just sit there in silence and just take a walk, even you don't have to be in a room, you can just take a walk and say, I'm not interested in thinking, and just let go of thoughts and just look at the tree, and all of a sudden it comes alive, and you say, whoa, you get a completely different hit from reality as you do that. And for me, that all of a sudden it makes, like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, it's not just an abstract thing, it's the truth. I mean, when I let go of any of these finite formal systems, any thought, all of a sudden I am the deep reality. I am the unlimited truth. And it's stunning. You just walk in it, and then I go back to sleep, right? Then I go back into the dream world, and there I am defending myself and trying to, upset, but someone did this to cut me off on the road, and then you wake up again and go, oh, okay, I don't need to think, and whoa, well, I'm so it's really it's interesting, and it I would say early on in the meditation, it was all painful. And it was no fun. It was just the little brief silences here and there where you get some hint that, but it was mostly just me facing all this jungle of emotions and thoughts and so forth. And but after 20 years, I did it because I didn't want to take drugs to help me sleep and so forth. That's why. So I wasn't for any deep reason. I don't want to take drugs, so I'll use meditation to help me deal with all this stuff. But then you realize, okay, well, wait, this is sort of important on its own, and then you begin to realize, no, this is really what it's all about. And then, wow, letting go of thought. Even though I'm a scientist and I think, now there's this distinction between these thoughts that are just useless, and so I don't need to think at all, versus very careful thoughts where I'm not thinking about how to polish my image, and I'm just now thinking on a nice technical problem. That's perfectly fine. Other than that, then why not just let go of thought? And then my feeling is, when I want a really good idea, it's time to let go of thought, because when I go into that space, I really am that unlimited intelligence. And that's where the real gems of ideas come from, is when I literally say, okay, no thought at all. No thought. Of course, it's been helped because I've been thinking about a technical issue. Now I let go of the thoughts, and all of a sudden you get new ideas. So I actually think that this will again be science and spirituality interacting in the future in a really interesting way, where scientists begin to realize, no, wait, this perennial philosophy is how, if properly understood, how you get your best ideas when you go into absolute silence. So once again, it's the back and forth between the absolute silence and then the precise thinking. That's what really intrigues me. That's the heart of the game. Absolute silence, no thinking, and then not vague thinking, not hand-waving thinking. Precise thinking is what gets rewarded. That's what I want to see and understand better going forward, to the extent it can be understood. Maybe I just have to be it and not know it.
Rupert, in fact, a question, I suppose, for both of you, actually, this. So that letting go of self-referential thought, i.e. my reputation, how I appear to others, etc., that is seeing through the illusion of the separate self, is it not? Rupert?
Yes, you could say that. It's really going directly to the experience. If we go directly to the experience of simply being is our fundamental experience prior to thoughts, sensations, perceptions, that there is just the experience of being, or the awareness of being. And that's always there, so to speak, in the background of experience, colored or obscured to a greater or lesser extent by thoughts, perceptions, sensations, and so on. So if we go, and the illusion, so normally we derive our sense of ourself. Everyone has a sense of being myself. And we all derive that from the fact of being. But most people's sense of their self is limited because our being is mixed with the content of experience, thoughts, images, feelings, and so on. So most people's sense of their self is a combination of their essential being, which is utterly intimate and yet impersonal, and the qualities of experience. And this mixture of our essential being and the qualities of experience makes for what's called the ego or the separate self, the illusory self. But as I said before, the illusory self is not non-existent. It is real, but it's not what it appears to be. What is it really? Pure being, utterly intimate, but impersonal and infinite. How does it appear? Temporary and finite. So in the progressive paths, you have to work your way back through all the illusory layers and finally end up with the awareness of being. In the direct path, we just go to the awareness of being. I mean, everyone has the experience of being. It's not, there's nothing, it's so simple. Everybody can say of their experience, I am. Well, all that's necessary is to take the thought I am before it is qualified by experience and just go to the experience of being to which it refers. And it is that cuts through the illusion of being a temporary, finite, separate self composed of thoughts and images and feelings. So in this very direct approach, we don't work through the illusion. We don't even investigate the illusion. We just go straight to the core feeling of being myself or I am, just the pure awareness of being. And if we can't look at that because we are it, but as Don said, if we know that by being that. And if we just go there, and if we were to try in our feeble way, if we were to try to describe that, there would be no limitations there. There'd be no qualities there. So it's that experience, if we can call it experience. It's a non-objective experience. It's that recognition that cuts through the illusion of being an ego, rather than cutting through the illusion of being an ego that leads to that experience.
Okay,
it's that experience. It's that cuts through the illusion of being a separate self.
Now, you do make it sound very simple, Rupert, and I understand it is. I understand it is simple, but the mind does have a propensity to pop up and go, am I doing this right? Is this really it? How do I know? Etc. etc. So, that's certainly been my experience. Sometimes I'm like, I'm there, and then I'm not there, or yes. So what to do then?
Well, as Don very nicely described, 20 years ago, to begin with, you close your eyes, you turn away from your experience of the world, and you just face a jungle of sensations, feelings, and thoughts. That's all there is. It's torture. But if you persist, and I don't mean in a skillful way, if you were, for instance, to ask yourself, but what is it that is aware of these thoughts and feelings? And that takes your attention one step further back. Initially, our attention is with the world. We close our eyes. Our attention is with our thoughts and feelings. But you then ask, but what is aware of these thoughts and feelings? That takes us one step back. And you may be only able to stay there 4 or 5 seconds to begin with before the thoughts and feelings take you away again. And then you lose yourself for 10 minutes, but then you ask yourself, but what is it that is aware of these? Or that's just one of question that you could ask. And with that question, again, you just take a brief step back. Oh, I am aware of them. These are not what I essentially am. They are what appear to me. And you keep going back and forth like that. And in time, you just find that you begin naturally, effortlessly, you begin to find yourself remaining as that in the face of your thoughts and feelings. The tyranny of thoughts and feelings lose their power over you. To begin with, they continue, but they lose their power over you. And in time, they just die down and until it becomes quite easy. As Don said, you just close your eyes And there's no methodology. You no longer have to ask yourself a question such as, who am I, or what is it that is aware of you? You just close your eyes and you just go straight back to being. And then when you're walking down the street, if your attention is not required by the world, or you pay the lightest attention to the world to make sure you don't step out in front of that bus, but the rest of your attention is with being. And it's simple. It's easy. I agree that to begin with, there is a little bit of a battle between our thoughts and feelings. And so we go back and forth. But in time, there's less and less back and forth until we begin to feel our being is not just something we visit from time to time, but it's where we begin to live. And then we're still capable of using, I loved your description, Don, there's less and less inclination to think just randomly, but your thinking becomes a really fine tool which you use, and when you don't need it, you go back home, you go back to being.
Don, just from you, in terms of someone who's perhaps where you were at the start, okay, you're meditating just to avoid having to take sleeping pills, for example, or whatever it may be. How about, what advice would you give in terms of refinement, in terms of settling into the deep ground of being?
Well, I think that one thing that's helped me a lot, Rupert and other spiritual teachers have made wonderful meditative tapes. And I found that sitting and listening to those tapes is a wonderful way to calm your mind. So if there's too much going on in there, you sit down and it's just a jungle. I found that listening to Rupert or like Eckhart Tolle, I found very, very helpful. These really sort of help move me into that space, and then I can turn the tape off and just be silent. So that's very, very helpful. I would say this. What has really been the hardest thing for me was to stop judging myself. Learning to not judge yourself, to just say, hey, thoughts come up. Oh, look at that. I got angry. Oh, I that's selfish. I shouldn't be selfish. Well, wait a minute. Okay. No, that just came up. So to learn to just look at this stuff and not take it personally, to not judge myself. That's the most painful thing, is the self-judgment, and learning to just watch that self-judgment come up. See, the problem is I identified with it. The judgment comes up and I say, oh, that's absolutely true. And I identify with that judgment. That was the one that has gotten me over and over again for 20 years. So that's the one that I'm finally starting to be able to look through. That one is the self-critical judgment that I always identified with. So if you find you're judging yourself, then also judging other people, it's that judgment. So Jesus, he said, do not judge lest you be judged yourself. Well, judging yourself is one of the most painful things you can do to yourself. And learning to just see the judgment and then smile at it and let it go. But that's easier said than done.
And that's true of others as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My judgments of others as well. I don't know why they cut me off on the road. I don't know why they did that. And I'm in no position to judge.
Right. Okay. Now, just the final bit. We've covered a lot, and you've just talked a lot about.
Yeah, because then I have to go to another.
Yes. Okay. Right. Very final bit then. Just on fear, Don, because we've talked about thoughts, and I know that you had a particularly tumultuous time last year with COVID, where actually, you nearly died, and you sometimes, you spoke about how scary that was, and actually even contemplating the matters that we've been speaking about today, how scary that can sometimes be. So I just wonder if you could both just share some final thoughts on, we've touched on thoughts themselves, but on the fears that are deeper than thoughts. Don.
Right. Well, the fears, I realize, come from my beliefs, and they actually have their origin in part in my thoughts, also part in just my biology, my amygdala and so forth. But yeah, I was a year ago, June or May, I had a heart rate of 180 beats per minute for 36 hours, they couldn't stop it. So I texted my wife goodbye because that was it. So I texted her goodbye, and it was, I didn't feel great. You just, at some point you just want to die because you feel so bad. And fortunately they found something that brought my heart rate down, and they could keep me alive long enough to get a surgery, cardiac ablation. And it was such a mess. It took them, I don't know, 4.5 hours to find all the spots and get rid of it. It really had messed me up. So, and then the drugs that I had to take were so, I'm apparently a 2d6 poor metabolizer. So the Bistolic that I took, which is a drug that keeps your heart rate down and so forth, that it affects your levels of autonomic nervous system and so forth. Anyway, side effects are depression, anxiety, and insomnia. And because I was a 2d6 poor metabolizer, the dose was 8 times too big for me. The standard, so I got an overdose of something that gives you insomnia, depression, and anxiety. So it took me a year. It's taken me almost a year, but I would say 9 months to recover from that. I had to use meditation and so forth because I had got completely programmed into insomnia, depression, and anxiety. So this is after 19 years of meditation. Now I had to face a chemical that had intervened and sent me all the way back to worse than I'd ever been before. And so this has been a tough year. But I, with love of my wife and good friends and meditation and so forth. So it's been this has been a year in which the meditation has saved my life, and it's allowed me to get back on my feet. I stepped out May of 2021, stopped tweeting, stopped doing everything. I didn't start tweeting until March of this year. I just couldn't. I was just trying to stay alive from last May until March of this year, just trying to stay alive. And so now I'm back on my feet and better than ever before, but it was a painful journey. Very, very, very painful last year.
That sounds horrific, and I'm delighted that you obviously made it through in one piece. Rupert, do you have anything to say to that, and then also just about fear more broadly?
Yes, well, I know, Don, you have to go, so I'll be very brief. First of all, to say I had no idea all of that, Don. So, well, to say that I'm glad you pulled through, not just for me personally, but actually for the world, for everything you do in the world. I'm deeply grateful. And what can I add to that? Perhaps just one thing to add is that the extent to which we recognize the nature of our essential being or self and are established in it, to that extent, the existential fear of disappearance or death diminishes. And this existential fear of death or disappearance is one of the deepest emotions that we feel as a human being. We're often not even conscious of it directly. We're conscious of the way it displays itself in other areas of our life. But very often, if we trace back the more superficial feelings, you can trace it back to this existential fear of death or disappearance. And that's the sense of lack is another such feeling, the two core feelings of the separate self. And to the extent that we recognize our being and are established in that or as that, this both the sense of lack and the fear of death diminish.
Okay. Right. Well, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you both. And I just want to finish by saying one thing, which is that obviously I'm so grateful for both of you in terms of the work you do. But something I really admire about you both is that you very much walk the talk. And what I mean by that is if this understanding perhaps of not being separate and therefore being a loving human being. I know Rupert better than you, Don, but I can certainly tell it with you too, that you both very much walk the talk. And I don't think there's anything or very few things more important than that. So I want to thank you on that basis as well as for the work that you do. And just what a joy it's been chatting.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much, Simon. It's been a wonderful, great learning experience for me. I've learned a lot, and hopefully it'll feed into the research as well. I really appreciate this.
Likewise. I've learned a lot. I do learn a lot from listening to you in general Tom, but this conversation, I've understood more clearly some of the ideas that I've heard you talk about. I'm really grateful to that. And as you said earlier, that there's this dialogue between our two perspectives. It's beautiful, and it certainly informs. It goes both ways. And so thank you. I hope that we'll be able to continue it in some form. And thank you, Simon, for skillfully kind of teasing out our ideas and facilitating. You do it beautifully. Thank you.
Very much so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.